You're a farmer in England. The sun is just rising. The sea is calm. And then you see them. Dark shapes moving on the horizon. Long, sleek ships, their prows carved into snarling dragons. They glide silently, cutting through the waves. Dozens of them. And inside men. Fierce men, armed with axes, spears, and round shields. Men with fire in their eyes, hunger in their hearts, and nothing to lose. You know their name already. The Vikings. And you know what's coming. Across Europe, the story was always the same. No warning, no mercy. Villages burned. Monasteries looted. Kings humiliated. For centuries, the longships came like a storm, striking without pattern, without fear, and then vanishing back into the sea. But here's the truth. The Vikings were never meant to be unstoppable. They had no mighty empire behind them, no endless armies, no overflowing treasuries. They came from a harsh, frozen land where survival itself was a daily fight. Farmers, fishermen, traders, ordinary men. And yet, when they took up arms, they became something far greater. How did this happen? How did men of such humble beginnings transform into some of the most feared warriors in history? What gave them such power, such skill, such relentless will to fight? Tonight, we step into their world to uncover the truth. Because the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were warriors shaped by their culture, their environment, their weapons, and their beliefs. Warriors who embraced death itself. Warriors who left scars on kingdoms that lasted for centuries. This is the story of why the Vikings were so good at fighting, and why, for 1,000 years, the world remembered their name. To understand why the Vikings were such skilled fighters, we first need to step inside their world. A world where war was not an interruption of life, but the very measure of it. From the moment a boy could walk, he was surrounded by the tools of battle. The axe, the spear, the shield. They weren't just weapons, they were everyday objects. A farmer's axe for splitting wood could also split an enemy's skull. A spear that guarded cattle could just as easily pierce through chainmail. For the Vikings, the line between life and war was razor thin. But it wasn't just training that shaped them, it was expectation. In Viking society, courage and honor weren't luxuries. They were requirements. A man who showed cowardice in battle could lose respect, land, even family ties. To be Viking was to be a warrior. No matter if you were a farmer, a craftsman, or a trader, when the call came, you fought. And this culture of combat was fueled by belief. The Vikings saw life through the lens of fate. They believed the Norns, weavers of destiny, had already chosen the day and hour of every man's death. If death was unavoidable, why fear it? Far better to meet it head-on, axe in hand, than to die in shame. For those who fell bravely, there was an even greater reward, Valhalla. A hall of endless feasting and fighting, where Odin himself welcomed the slain. To die with courage was not a tragedy, it was triumph. It meant being chosen. Imagine the power of that belief. An army unshaken by death, convinced that falling in battle was a doorway to eternity. This warrior culture shaped every generation. Around fires, sagas told of great heroes, of duels fought and battles won. Children grew up on these tales, learning that greatness came not from wealth or peace, but from bold deeds and spilled blood. So when Viking longships landed on foreign shores, they didn't bring farmers pretending to be soldiers. They brought men already hardened by a way of life that demanded strength, honor, and courage above all else. But belief and culture alone could not explain their ferocity. Something else had forged them long before they even touched a battlefield, the harsh and unforgiving land of the North itself. Life in Scandinavia was not kind. For the men who would become Vikings, every day was a struggle, not against armies, but against nature itself. The winters were long and merciless. Survival demanded strength, endurance, and an iron will. Rowing longships across storm-churned seas built stamina that no training yard could match. Cutting timber, hauling stone, plowing stubborn fields. These were not exercises, but necessities. By the time a man was old enough to raid, his body had already been forged by labor into the frame of a warrior. He wasn't just fit. He was hardened by a life where weakness meant hunger, and hunger could mean death. This constant struggle shaped more than muscles. It shaped mentality. A Viking was used to enduring cold pain and exhaustion without complaint. He knew how to survive with little, how to adapt quickly, and how to keep pushing when others would collapse. Against well-fed armies of kings, these farmers-turned-raiders brought not only strength but resilience. And when hardship met opportunity, the results were explosive. A young man who had wrestled icy seas and fought for every harvest now took up an axe and shield. Raiding wasn't just greed, it was survival made glorious. Wealth abroad offered what the harsh homeland often denied: food, silver, and fertile lands. But to seize it, you needed the toughness to cross oceans, the endurance to march far from home, and the courage to fight seasoned warriors. Every Viking carried that toughness. They were athletes of survival, long before they became warriors of terror. But raw strength alone was not enough. To turn endurance into dominance, the Vikings needed weapons, tools designed not only to kill, but to terrify. Their arsenal was not vast or exotic, but it was devastating, because each weapon reflected the harsh practicality of their lives. The axe was their most iconic weapon. It was not always forged in fine iron, nor decorated with jewels, yet it was brutally effective. Many Viking warriors carried single-handed axes, light enough to swing quickly yet sharp enough to cleave through bone and shield alike. A skilled fighter could hook an enemy's weapon, tear down a shield, or strike from unexpected angles. The axe was cheap to make, easy to wield, and terrifying to face. And when larger, two-handed axes appeared, massive blades capable of splitting helmets and armor in a single strike. They became symbols of sheer destruction. Then there was the spear, the most common Viking weapon of all. Straightforward, versatile, and deadly, the spear could be used for thrusting in close combat or hurled with accuracy from a distance. Spears were practical. Iron spearheads were easier to forge than swords, and nearly every Viking could carry one. Imagine standing against a shield wall only to be met with a storm of spears raining down before the clash even began. But the sword was different. Expensive to forge, requiring far more iron and skill, the sword was a weapon of prestige. To own one was to display wealth and honor. Viking swords were double-edged, balanced for cutting and thrusting. Many were passed down for generations, named like living companions, and treated with reverence. In the sagas, a warrior's sword was often his legacy, remembered long after his death. To face a man with such a weapon was to face not only steel but status. And beyond these, there were other tools of war: bows for hunting and ambush, sea axes, long knives used in both daily life and brutal close combat. But perhaps the most important weapon of all was the shield. Round, wooden, rimmed with iron, painted in bold colors, shields were not just for defense. Together they created the legendary Viking shield wall, a living barrier of men, wood, and iron. Behind it, the Vikings advanced as one, unbroken, until the enemy lines shattered. What made these weapons terrifying was not their elegance or complexity, but their ruthless practicality. They were built for killing quickly and efficiently, for spreading fear as much as blood. An axe buried in a shield, a spear whistling through the air, a wall of painted wood advancing like a tide. These sights alone were enough to break the courage of many enemies before a single blow was struck. The Vikings didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with the image those weapons created, an image of unstoppable fury. But weapons alone did not make the Vikings so fearsome. Many kingdoms had axes, swords, and shields. What truly set them apart was the way they fought, the cunning, speed, and mobility that turned ordinary raids into legendary campaigns. At the heart of Viking warfare was the longship. Sleek, narrow, and shallow-bottomed, it was an engineering marvel for its time. Unlike the heavy warships of continental Europe, Viking longships could cut swiftly across open seas, yet also glide silently up rivers only a few feet deep. This meant nowhere was safe. From coastal villages to towns far inland, if water flowed, the Vikings could reach you. Imagine being a farmer hundreds of miles from the ocean, only to see dragon-proud ships appear suddenly on the riverbank. That unpredictability spread terror across Europe. Speed was their greatest ally. While most medieval armies moved slowly, burdened by supply wagons and heavy cavalry, Viking raiding parties could travel light, strike fast, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. A monastery might burn before local lords even realized an enemy was near. By the time they gathered troops, the longships were already gone, their sails vanishing over the horizon. But speed was only one part of their strategy. Surprise was the other. Vikings rarely fought on terms their enemies expected. They attacked at dawn, during festivals, even in the dead of winter when most armies lay dormant. To them there was no season for war. Any moment was a chance to strike. When open battle was necessary, the Vikings employed the shield wall, a tactic simple in concept but deadly in execution. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, forming a near-impenetrable barrier. As one, they advanced, axes and spears thrusting through the gaps. It demanded discipline and unity, and the effect was devastating, a wall of iron and oak grinding down enemy lines. And when the moment was right, the wall could split apart, unleashing a sudden, ferocious charge. They also adapted quickly. Against cavalry, they learned to break formations and fight in rough terrain, where horses faltered. Against castles, they launched daring sieges, sometimes hauling ships across land to strike from unexpected directions. Their creativity in battle was as dangerous as their steel. Most importantly, Viking warriors fought as raiders, not soldiers. They didn't march to defend borders or maintain order. They fought to take the wealth, land, glory, and that hunger made them unpredictable. Where kings and emperors moved with politics and treaties in mind, the Vikings moved with opportunity. A rich coastal town was a target. A rival king's weakness was a chance. Strategy wasn't bound by rules, it was shaped by ambition. This combination of speed, surprise, and ferocity gave the Vikings a psychological edge. Enemies never knew when or where they might appear, and when they did, the terror of their tactics often won battles before the fighting even began. But perhaps the most terrifying element of all wasn't just how they fought. It was how they viewed life and death itself. And to understand that, we must step into the Viking soul, where faith and fearlessness forged warriors unlike any the world had ever seen. The Vikings lived in a world shaped by fate. They believed in the Norns, mysterious beings who spun, measured, and cut the threads of every life. No man, no king, no warrior could escape the destiny woven for him. That meant fear was useless. If you were meant to die, you would die, whether by blade, disease, or storm. But if you were destined to live, no enemy's strike could change that. This belief created a warrior without hesitation. Where others might retreat clinging to life, the Viking pressed forward, certain that his death would only come at its appointed hour. And if it came in battle, all the better, because for the Norsemen there was no greater fate than to fall with a weapon in hand. The sagas tell us of Valhalla, the great hall of Odin where the bravest warriors were taken after death. There they feasted endlessly, drank from horns of mead, and fought daily upon vast fields, wounds healing each night so the battles could begin anew. It was not paradise of peace, but paradise of struggle, a warrior's dream. To die on the battlefield was to join the honored dead, the Einherjar, preparing to fight beside the gods themselves in Ragnarok, the final cosmic war. This belief turned fear into fuel. Imagine standing against men who welcomed death, who saw your sword not as a threat but as a gift, a chance at eternal glory. How do you break the will of someone who does not fear dying? For many foes of the Vikings, the answer was simple. You didn't. Their courage itself was a weapon, but it wasn't only about Valhalla. Their culture glorified reputation. A man's name lived longer than his body. Cowardice stained honor forever, while bravery carved a place in story and song. Skalds, the poets of the Norse, immortalized those who fought fiercely. To fall in fear was to vanish from memory. To die boldly was to live forever in the sagas. Even rituals reflected this warrior spirit. Funeral rites, from fiery ship burials to sacrifices made in honor of the dead, reinforced the bond between life, death, and battle. Death was woven into daily life, not hidden away. Children grew up knowing their fathers, uncles, and ancestors might die with sword in hand, and that this was something to admire, not fear. So when Viking war bands crossed seas and stormed foreign shores, they carried more than axes and shields. They carried a faith that turned them into unstoppable forces, men who did not see defeat as destruction, but as transcendence. Yet faith alone could not keep them victorious forever. The world they raided was changing, and powerful enemies would rise to challenge even the fiercest of Norse warriors. And if you want to measure the power of the Vikings, don't look only at their sagas. Look at the words of their enemies. Across medieval Europe, the Vikings left scars not just on the land, but on memory itself. They were remembered not as mere raiders, but as a terror that came from the sea without warning. Take the monks of England. For them, the arrival of the longships was nothing short of apocalypse. In the year 793, the great monastery at Lindisfarne was stormed by Norse raiders. The church was looted, sacred relics stolen, priests slaughtered or enslaved. One chronicler wrote of heathen men who desecrated God's house with plunder and slaughter. To the Christian mind of the time, the Vikings were not just enemies of men, they were enemies of God himself. This fear spread quickly. Kings and nobles across Europe learned that the Norse could not be predicted. They struck in England, Ireland, France, even Spain and Italy. The great river cities, Paris, Rouen, London, all faced their fury. Imagine the panic of hearing that longships had been spotted upriver, knowing they could reach your walls within hours. The Frankish King Charles the Bald famously paid vast sums of silver simply to make the raiders leave. Other rulers built fortresses along rivers, tried to block waterways, even created special defenses called burhs in England to resist surprise attacks. The fact that kingdoms reshaped their very defenses around the Viking threat speaks to the scale of fear they inspired. But fear was not only born of destruction. It was psychological. The Vikings carried an aura of otherness. They worshipped strange gods, performed brutal rituals, and lived by codes alien to the Christian world. Stories spread of berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, immune to pain, howling like beasts. Were these tales exaggerated? Perhaps. But they magnified the terror of facing the Norse. To enemies, the Vikings seemed not quite human, but creatures of chaos itself. Yet even in this fear, there was respect. Chroniclers cursed them. Kings despised them, but few dismissed them. They were acknowledged as warriors of immense skill, men who could humble empires and force concessions from mighty rulers. In time, some kingdoms even learned to imitate their tactics, adopting Viking-style ships and raiding strategies. Fear gave way, slowly, to adaptation, and still, the legacy endured. For centuries after the Viking Age faded, the memory of the dragon-proud ships lingered in Europe's imagination. To children, they were nightmares whispered by firelight. To kings, they were a reminder that even the greatest thrones could tremble before unexpected foes. The Vikings were not invincible. Eventually, the world learned to fight back. But the fact that their enemies remembered them first with fear, and only later with victory, tells us everything about why they remain legends of war. They were not the largest armies, nor the wealthiest kingdoms. They had no empires of stone, no vast treasuries of gold, yet their name struck fear across a continent. Why? Because they carried with them the perfect storm, a culture that glorified courage, a land that bred toughness, weapons as brutal as they were practical, tactics that shattered expectations, and above all, a mindset that turned death itself into an ally. To their enemies, they were demons from the sea. To themselves, they were men chasing glory, honor, and immortality in story and song. And though their age of raids eventually ended, their legacy never faded. Even today, the image of the longship prow breaking through the morning mist still sends a shiver down the spine. The Vikings remind us of something timeless, that power does not always come from numbers, wealth, or titles. Sometimes it comes from belief so fierce that it makes ordinary men unstoppable. So the next time you hear the crash of waves or the creak of wood on water, imagine what it must have felt like 1,000 years ago, to see the dragon-headed ships appear on the horizon, and to know the storm had come. This was the Viking way of war. This was why the world feared them. If you enjoyed this journey into the Viking mind and their art of war, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. More tales of blood, steel, and forgotten history are coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss them.